All right. First century Christians didn't have a Bible. Let's listen in.
Was sola scriptura present in the Old Testament? Was sola scriptura present in the first century? So, right, like that's a fundamental problem for them. So they're first century Christians basing their faith on Scripture. Did first century Christians have a Bible to use? No. No, absolutely not. So what role did Scripture and the Bible have for first century Christians? Well, it was tradition. The apostles, they knew what the teachings were. They knew which epistles. They knew which gospels. You know, out of all the Gnostic gospels that began to emerge in the second century, first the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Jude.
Yeah, all right, that's enough. So he says the early Christians didn't have a Bible to use. Absolutely not. And then he says, what use did they make of the Bible? I mean, the guy can't get his story straight. Either they had a Bible or they didn't have a Bible. You can't just say the early Christians, first century Christians, absolutely did not have a Bible, and then ask the question, how did they use the Scriptures or the Bible? And then give your silly nonsense answer about it's tradition. Now, this lie that early Christians didn't have a Bible is blown up by the fact that there's a little thing called the Septuagint. It's called the Septuagint. This is the Bible of the first century Christians. This is what they used. It's also right here in the Orthodox Study Bible. That is what the Old Testament is made of, is the Septuagint. It's a translation of the Septuagint. Furthermore, we can look at this little book here called The Apostolic Fathers with Justin Martyr and Irenaeus. This is this is part of the set published by Henderson, by Philip Schaff, edited by Philip Schaff. Great little set. You should buy it. So you can go look at these books. You can look at the text that they quote. This is the Apostolic Fathers. This is first century Christians. And you can see them quoting the Old Testament. And you go in there and they're quoting basically every book in the New Testament. And they're even quoting books like Hebrews and Revelation, which were disputed amongst Christians. You know, they were excluded from some canon list and not from others, but they were debated over. Here in Justin, these are Justin Martyr's texts, and he is also quoting from Hebrews and Revelation, disputed books. Irenaeus, and we're going to talk about him more in a second, but Irenaeus, you can look at his text here. He's quoting basically all of the Old Testament, and I want to pay close attention to this. These are his citations, his only citations of the Deuterocanon. Yeah. Think about that. Think about that. This is the Old Testament he's quoting, and he only has these little few citations. What's that? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 citations from the Deuterocanon. Then we've got all the Gospels, basically every single book in the Bible except for 3rd John. 3rd John is missing, but he's got also Hebrews. He's quoting from Hebrews, and he's quoting from Revelation, quite a lot of text from Revelation, but that should be no surprise because he's a student of Polycarp who was a student of John. So I don't think he would have a problem with the Revelation because it was written by John. So now how are they treating these texts as just a tradition? No. Let's read what Irenaeus has to say about this. This is from Book 3 of Against Heresies, Chapter 1. Here we go. We're just going to read a little bit. We have learned from none others the plan of our salvation than from those through whom the gospel has come down to us, which they did at one time proclaim in public, and at a later period, by the will of God, handed down to us in the Scriptures to be the ground and pillar of our faith. That's right. The written Scriptures are the ground and pillar of our faith. One time, it was preached with a voice only. Now, they've come down to us in written form. And they are the ground and pillar of our faith. And we can see this same sentiment. We can see the same sentiment in the Old Testament. That the Scriptures are the ground and pillar of the faith. Let's see. This is Isaiah 8:20. It says, to the law, to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. What? How can you go to the law and to the testimony? when it's not complete? When Isaiah wrote this, the Old Testament wasn't complete. They certainly didn't have a New Testament. How can you have this sola scriptura-like verse when the whole testimony isn't there? Because that's a wrong argument. This argument that you can't have sola scriptura because you need a fully closed canon, and the canon was being formed and developed and no one really knew what it was, comes from a guy named JayDyer, right? It's just a fallacious, ridiculous argument, and he will point you to this book called The Biblical Canon by Lee Martin McDonald. And he claims that because in the back of the book you have various lists of a list of catalogs of Old Testament collections of these are various lists of canon, right? Now, you got Origen, you got Athanasius, you got Cyril, more lists here, and they all differ. They all differ slightly, not by much. Then you have the New Testament list of canon from Irenaeus, from Origen, and they differ slightly. But the point is, what Mr. Dyer is missing is that they have a list at all. That they have a canonical list of scriptures at all. Why did they have these lists? Because, as Irenaeus has told us, these scriptures, who have come down to us in written form, are the ground and pillar of our faith. Now, he likes to reference this book quite a lot, in his attempts to mock and ridicule and tear down the doctrine of sola scriptura. And he says, well, they can't have sola scriptura because they didn't have a fully formed Bible. But let's look at what Lee Martin McDonald actually writes. This is page 216. There is little doubt that the core of the biblical collection of authoritative books is essentially the same collection we now have in the Protestant OT collection. What is in question in canonical studies are books on the fringe. These fringe books included both canonical and apocryphal books, were disputed among Jews and Christians for centuries, even though many leaders in the church and synagogue freely quoted these writings in an authoritative manner, sometimes using the designation scripture or as it is written to refer to them. Remarkably, these disputes took place for centuries after the decision was supposedly made about its canonicity. Yet, in neither group, those who accepted and those who rejected the authority and inspiration of this literature, was there any noticeable change in theology? Now, how about this one? The decision whether to accept or reject the deuterocanonical literature is not at the core of what Christianity is all about. As the law of Moses formed the core of the OT, so also the Gospels and Paul have been at the heart of the New Testament biblical canon since the 2nd century, even though there was a great deal of dispute over the Deutero-Pauline epistles, especially the pastorals, Hebrews, the Catholic or general epistles, and Revelation. The Jews and later the Christians fully accepted the law of Moses as the core of the sacred scriptures. Soon thereafter, most, if not all, the traditional prophets and many of the writings were accepted as canonical, but at the secondary of scripture, blah, blah, blah. The point is, this guy is saying they had a core of scriptures that were canon. And the issue is stuff on the fringe, like Hebrews. For Jay to say they didn't have a fully formed canon, as if that matters, and that you can't have sola scriptura because they didn't have a fully formed canon, is ridiculous. Because what he's telling you here is that there was, at the core of the Christians' biblical canon, was the OT and the NT. The Gospels and Paul have been at the heart of the New Testament biblical canon since the 2nd century. And since the 2nd century, then also since the 1st century, since they were written, and since they were dispersed and spread around, written and copied and given from church to church. So, this nonsense that the early Christians didn't have a Bible, and therefore couldn't appeal to the scriptures, and couldn't have any kind of doctrine close to or comparable with sola scriptura, is absolute nonsense. Let's look at Irenaeus once again. Once again, we have learned from none other the plan of our salvation than from those through whom the gospel has come down to us, which they did at one time proclaim in public, and at a later period, by the will of God, handed down to us in the scriptures to be the ground and pillar of our faith. This little book right here, this book is the ground and pillar of our faith. as Christians. If you reject that, then you are rejecting the tradition of the church, as it were. So, if anybody out there is listening and you say there's no sola scriptura because there's no fully formed canon in the early church, well, you're wrong. JayDyer is wrong. This guy, David Patrick Harry, is wrong. The early Christians, the first century Christians, most certainly had a Bible. And it was the ground and pillar of their faith.